The Nebraska Territory in the summer of 1867 was a land of unrelenting sun and merciless judgment, where a man's worth was measured by his courage and his word. In the dusty heart of Clearwater, a speck of a town carved from the endless prairie, Caleb Morrow stood alone in Murphy's saloon, his knuckles raw and bleeding. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the bitter tang of spilled whiskey, but the shouts of angry men cut through it like a knife. Yellow-bellied coward, spat Tom Harper, clutching a broken nose as he staggered to his feet. "Will died 'cause of you, Morrow." The words landed harder than the punch Caleb had just thrown, each syllable a reminder of the shame that clung to him like dust to his worn boots. 3 months ago, Caleb had been a respected cowboy, a man who could rope a steer faster than most, could draw a breath. Ranchers from across the territory paid good money for his skill on cattle drives, and his gray mare, Sage, trusted him with a loyalty that felt like family. But everything changed during an Apache raid in May. Caleb's hands trembled as he recalled that day, the memory as vivid as the blood on his knuckles now. He and Will had been riding fence lines, checking for breaks in the wire, when 15 warriors crested the hill, their painted faces fierce under the noon sun. Arrows whistled, horses screamed, and Will had grabbed his rifle, firing back with the stubborn grit of a man who'd never known fear. But Caleb's heart pounding, his breath shallow had frozen. The sight of those warriors, their war cries echoing like thunder, drained his courage like water from a cracked bucket. He'd spurred Sage and fled, leaving Will to face the raiders alone. By the time Caleb returned, shame burning hotter than the prairie sun, Will lay dead, 3 arrows in his chest, his body left for the buzzards. Now, the saloon's wooden walls seemed to close in, the faces of men who'd once shared his campfire twisted with disgust. "Get out, Morrow," said Murphy, the saloon owner, his voice heavy with exhaustion rather than malice. "These boys got every right to hate you. You've caused enough trouble." Caleb retrieved his dusty hat from the floor, its brim crumpled from the scuffle. No one met his eyes as he walked toward the swinging doors. Not Tom, not the ranch hands who'd once laughed at his stories, not even the bartender who'd poured him drinks on credit. The silence was louder than their shouts, a verdict on his soul. Outside, the Nebraska sun hammered Main Street, a single dirt road flanked by weathered buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a church with a sagging steeple, and Murphy's saloon. Clearwater was no metropolis, just a scattering of hopes pinned to a harsh land where most folks lived on ranches miles apart, wrestling a living from the grassland. Caleb's cabin, 5 miles east, was his refuge and his prison. It was a modest dream, one's 2 rooms, a porch, a patch of land bought with years of savings. Now, it felt like a tomb for a man who'd lost everything but his shame. Sage waited at the hitching post, her brown eyes soft, unjudging. She nuzzled his shoulder as he untied her reins, and for a moment, Caleb pressed his forehead against her neck, breathing in the familiar scent of horse and leather. "You're all I got left, girl," he whispered, climbing into the saddle. The ride home took an hour, the rolling hills and swaying grass, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his chest. Prairie dogs chattered from their burrows, and a red-tailed hawk soared overhead, hunting in the fading light. The land could be beautiful, Caleb thought, when a man had hope. Today, it looked as empty as his heart. At the cabin, he unsaddled Sage and let her drink from the trough he'd built last winter. The little house sagged under the weight of neglect-roof shingles loose, porch steps creaking, weeds choking the foundation. Caleb sat on those steps, the wood warm from the day's heat, and stared at the horizon. No neighbors, no smoke from distant chimneys, just the hum of insects and the whisper of wind. This was his life now, a man alone, defined by one moment of fear. He'd tried to make amends offering to work for Will's widow, leaving money at his grave, but nothing erased the truth. Caleb Morrow was a coward, and Clearwater would never let him forget it. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, when 3 riders appeared across the prairie. Their silhouettes were unmistakable, even at a distance. Silas Reed led them, his black stallion kicking up dust. Behind him rode Nate Carver and Jim Holt, loyal as hounds but twice as mean. Silas had been Caleb's friend once, back when they'd driven cattle together, sharing jokes under starlit skies. But Silas had a cruel streak, a hunger for others' pain that grew sharper after Caleb's disgrace. "Evenin', Caleb," Silas called as they neared, his voice slick with false warmth, like a rattler pretending to be a songbird. "Mind if we water our horses?" Caleb nodded toward the trough, his throat tight. These men hadn't come for water. Something darker was afoot. Silas dismounted, letting his horse drink, while Nate and Jim stayed in their saddles, hands resting near their revolvers. "Heard some talk in town," Silas said, fanning himself with his hat. "About you livin' out here all alone. No wife, no kin, no future." His smile showed too many teeth, sharp and predatory. "Folks think you need fixin'." Caleb's stomach turned to ice, the heat of the evening forgotten. "Don't need fixin'," he said, his voice low. "Oh, you're wrong there, friend," Silas replied, glancing at his companions. "We heard about a family in a bind. Got a daughter they can't keep. Abigail Turner's her name. Pretty, they say, 'cept for one thing." He paused, savoring the moment. "Wagon accident 2 years back. Broke her spine. Can't walk no more." Caleb's jaw tightened. He could see where this was going, the cruel joke taking shape in Silas's eyes. "Her uncle's desperate to marry her off," Silas continued, his tone mock, sympathetic. "Offerin' $50 and a silver watch that was her pa's. Thing is, no decent man'll take her. But you," he let the words hang, heavy with scorn. "You ain't got options, Morrow. A coward and a crippled girl sounds like a match made in hell." Nate laughed, a harsh bark that grated on Caleb's nerves. "Why you tellin' me this?" Caleb asked, though he dreaded the answer. "'Cause we're your friends," Silas said, his smile slipping into something colder. "And the Turner family's payin' a finder's fee to anyone who solves their problem. We're just helpin' out." The truth was as ugly as Caleb had feared. They were selling Abigail like livestock, dumping her on a man they deemed equally worthless, all for a cut of the money. It was a transaction dressed up as charity, and Caleb was the punchline. "I need time to think," he said, his voice barely steady. Sure, Silas replied, remounting his horse. "But don't think too long. The Turners are gettin' antsy. Might find another bachelor if you dawdle." As the riders vanished into the twilight, their laughter echoing across the prairie, Caleb sat frozen on his porch. The stars began to emerge, cold and distant, offering no answers. Was this rock bottom, or could he fall further? The weight of his shame pressed harder now, mingled with a new, unfamiliar stirring anger, perhaps, or the ghost of his old honor, whispering that he could still choose who he'd be. Inside the cabin, Caleb lit a single lamp, its flicker casting shadows on the rough walls. He pulled Will's old knife from a drawer, its blade worn but sharp, and turned it over in his hands. He'd kept it as a reminder of his failure, a punishment he couldn't escape. But tonight, as Silas's words replayed in his mind, the knife felt different, not a burden, but a challenge. Abigail Turner, a woman he'd never met, was being cast aside like he was. Two broken souls, the town called them. Yet something in Caleb rebelled at the idea. He didn't know her, didn't know if he could face her, but he knew he couldn't let Silas's cruelty define them both. As the lamp burned low, Caleb made a choice no for redemption, not yet, but for defiance. He'd meet this woman not as a coward, but as a man who still had one thing left to give, his honor. The dawn broke over the Nebraska territory in July 1867 with a quiet ferocity, the sky bleeding pink and gold across the endless prairie. Caleb Morrow stood on the sagging porch of his cabin, 5 miles east of Clearwater, his calloused hands gripping the railing as if it could anchor him against the storm of doubt in his chest. He hadn't slept. The night had been a restless battle, his mind churning over Silas Reed's cruel proposition: marry Abigail Turner, a paralyzed woman discarded by her family, for $50 and a silver watch. The offer was a mockery, a twisted jest meant to humiliate them both. Yet Caleb had agreed not out of greed, but because something in Silas's sneer had sparked a flicker of defiance. He couldn't name it yet, but it felt like the ghost of the man he used to be, the one who'd once believed in honor. The prairie was still, save for the soft rustle of tall grass and the distant call of a meadowlark. Caleb's gray mare, Sage, snorted from the corral, her breath misting in the cool morning air. The cabin behind him, a two-room shack with peeling paint and a leaky roof, felt smaller today, as if it knew a stranger was coming to share its loneliness. He'd swept the floor, cleared a corner for her things, and dragged his own cot to the main room, leaving the bedroom for her. It was the least he could do, he told himself, for a woman who deserved better than being bartered like cattle. His stomach knotted at the thought of meeting her. What could he say to someone pawned off as a joke? How could he face her? A man branded a coward by every soul in Clearwater. The sound of creaking wheels broke his thoughts. A wagon appeared over the hill, its canvas cover flapping in the breeze, pulled by a pair of weary mules. The driver, a thin man with gray whiskers and a slouched hat, guided the team with the sluggishness of someone eager to be elsewhere. Caleb straightened, wiping sweat from his palms onto his faded jeans. This was it, Abigail Turner, the woman he'd agreed to marry, sight unseen, in a deal that felt more like a sentence than a vow. The wagon rolled to a stop, kicking up dust that hung in the air like a veil. The driver climbed down, his movements stiff, and glanced at Caleb with weary eyes. "You Morrow?" he asked, voice rough as gravel. "I am," Caleb replied, his throat dry. He stepped forward, hat in hand, feeling the weight of the moment like a stone on his chest. "Name's Amos Turner, Abigail's uncle." The man didn't offer a handshake, his gaze flickering to the cabin with something like pity. "Got your bride here along with her things." The word bride landed like a slap, cold and transactional. Amos shuffled to the back of the wagon, untying the canvas with practiced efficiency. "She ain't much trouble," he said, not looking at Caleb. "Keeps to herself. Can sew, read, write. Just needs help movin' around, if you catch my meanin'." Caleb's mouth felt like sand. He wanted to ask questions about her life, why her family had cast her out, but the words stuck. "Maybe I should meet her first," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's awake," Amos said, pulling back the canvas. "Been up since before sunrise." The wagon bed was padded with blankets and a thin mattress, and there, propped against a pile of quilts, was Abigail Turner. She was not what Caleb had expected. Her hair, the color of ripe wheat, spilled over her shoulders in soft waves, catching the dawn's light. Her skin was pale, like fresh cream, but it was her eyes blue as a summer sky, sharp and searching, that stopped him cold. They held a sadness, deep and unguarded, but also a quiet fire, as if she'd learned to guard her heart without losing its strength. She wore a simple green dress, its hem neatly folded over legs that lay still, and her hands rested on a carved wooden box in her lap, fingers tracing its edges with a reverence Caleb couldn't place. "You must be Caleb," she said, her voice soft but steady, like a stream over smooth stones. There was no warmth in it, but no bitterness either, just a careful neutrality, as if she were measuring him. "Ma'am," Caleb said, touching the brim of his hat, "I'm glad to meet you." The lie tasted bitter. He wasn't glad, not about this, not about the deal that had brought her here. But his mother, long gone, had taught him to be kind to women, and this one, with her piercing gaze, deserved more than the raw truth. Abigail's eyes studied him, unblinking, like she could see the shame etched into his bones. "They told you about my condition?" she asked, her tone matter-of-fact. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said, his face heating. He glanced at Amos, who was unloading trunks with the haste of a man fleeing a fire. "And you're still willing to go through with this arrangement?" Caleb hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down. Amos was watching now, his hands paused on a rope, waiting for an answer that would let him leave. "I reckon so," Caleb said finally, the words heavy but honest. He didn't know why he'd agreed, not fully, but turning her away felt like another kind of running, and he was tired of running. Abigail's lips curved, not quite a smile, but something close a weary acknowledgement, like she'd heard promises before and learned not to trust them. "Well then," she said, "I suppose we should get started." Moving Abigail from the wagon to the cabin was a clumsy ordeal. Her wheelchair, a sturdy contraption with iron wheels and leather straps, was heavier than Caleb expected, and Amos's strength was meager. Caleb lifted her carefully, his arms steady despite his nerves, and felt the warmth of her frame against his chest. She was light but solid, her body tense as she gripped his shoulder. "I can hold myself up," she said sharply, and he nodded, easing her into the chair. By the time they settled her on the bed, he'd prepared fresh linens, a quilt his mother had made. They were all breathless, the silence thick with awkwardness. "There's a chair in the wagon," Amos said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Special. Made for her. Cost a pretty penny, but Abigail paid for it herself." The chair was a marvel, with handles she could turn to move independently, its wood polished to a soft gleam. Caleb wondered how a woman with no work had afforded it, but Abigail answered as if reading his thoughts. "I had savings," she said, her voice clipped, "from before." Amos brought in her belongings, two trunks of clothes and books, a sewing kit, and that wooden box, which she clutched tightly. He worked fast, eager to leave. "It's for a year," he told Caleb, handing over a leather pouch that clinked with coins. $50 as promised, plus my brother's watch. The silver timepiece was heavy, engraved with initials Caleb couldn't read. "Abigail's pa was a good man," Amos said, his eyes on the watch. "Deserved better than what he got. Hope you'll remember that." With that, he climbed into the wagon and drove off, the mule's hoofbeats fading into the prairie's hum. Alone, Caleb and Abigail sat in the cabin's dim light, the air heavy with unspoken truths. The space felt too small for two, its rough walls and sparse furniture a stark contrast to the vastness outside. Caleb had lived here alone so long he'd forgotten how to share it. "I should lay out some rules," he said, breaking the silence, his voice rougher than he meant. "Rules?" Abigail raised an eyebrow, her fingers still on the box. "About how this'll work," he stammered, his face flushing. "You take the bed. I'll sleep out here on the floor or a cot. And I won't, I don't expect." He trailed off, mortified. "You don't have to pretend this is a real marriage," Abigail said quietly, her eyes on the window, where the prairie stretched endless and free. "I know why I'm here. You need the money, and I need a roof. That's the deal." Her words should have relieved him, but they stung, making him feel small, selfish. "It ain't just the money," he said, though he wasn't sure what else it was. Loneliness, maybe, or the hope that two broken people could find something worth salvaging. "Then what is it?" she asked, her blue eyes locking onto his, sharp and unyielding. Caleb had no answer, not one he could voice. The truth that he was so alone he'd married a stranger just to hear another voice was too raw. "We'll figure it out," he said, turning away. Abigail nodded, wheeling herself to the window. "It's quiet here," she said, almost to herself. "I like quiet." Outside, a hawk circled, its wings cutting clean arcs against the sky. Caleb watched her silhouette, the sunlight catching the gold in her hair, and felt a strange ache. This woman, a stranger, was now his wife. And for the first time in months, he wondered if the prairie might hold more than just his shame. The Nebraska prairie in late July 1867 shimmered under a relentless sun, its tall grasses bending in a breeze that carried the scent of dust and wildflowers. Inside Caleb Morrow's cabin, 5 miles east of Clearwater, the air was stifling, thick with the tension of two strangers learning to share a space never meant for two. 2 weeks had passed since Abigail Turner arrived, her wheelchair a stark reminder of the cruel deal that bound them, a marriage orchestrated by Silas Reed's malice, sealed with $50 and a silver watch. Caleb had expected awkwardness, but not this. A daily dance of missteps and silences, where every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo their unspoken doubts. Yet, beneath the strain, something fragile was taking root, a bond forged in small, hard-won moments that neither dared name. The cabin was a battlefield of practicality. Its narrow doorways snagged Abigail's wheelchair, forcing her to maneuver with a precision that left her jaw tight. The kitchen counter, built for a standing man, loomed out of reach, and the single table wobbled under the weight of their uneasy meals. Caleb, accustomed to solitude, fumbled in his attempts to help, his hands clumsy with the fear of offending her pride. Abigail, for her part, guarded her independence like a flame in a storm, her blue eyes flashing whenever he offered aid too quickly. This morning, the tension boiled over. A cast-iron pot slipped from her grasp as she tried to shift it from the stove, spilling beans across the floor in a clatter that seemed to shake the walls. "Damn it," she snapped, her voice sharp with a fury that wasn't just about the mess. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair, knuckles white, and Caleb saw the glint of tears she refused to let fall. "Let me help," he said, rising from the table where he'd been mending a torn shirt, his needle forgotten. He took a step toward her, but her glare stopped him cold. "No," Abigail said, her voice trembling but firm. "I can do this myself. I have to do this myself." She leaned forward, trying to scoop the beans with a rag, but the chair caught on the stove's edge, jarring her. The rag fell, and for a moment she sat still, her breath hitching as if the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. Caleb knelt beside the mess, picking up beans with slow, deliberate movements, giving her space to breathe. He'd seen that look before, not in her, but in himself, staring into the cracked mirror after the Apache raid, when shame had made every task feel like a judgment. "It ain't you," he said quietly, his voice rough but gentle. "It's this place. Wasn't built for two, especially not for someone moving in a chair like yours." Abigail's head snapped up, her eyes searching his face for pity. She found none, only a steady honesty that disarmed her. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone softer, cautious. "I mean the cabin's the problem," Caleb said, sitting back on his heels. "Doorway's too narrow, counter too high, floorboards uneven. It's like trying to ride a horse with a busted saddle. Ain't your fault it don't fit right." He paused, meeting her gaze. "We can fix it, make it work for both of us." Her lips parted, surprise softening the hard lines of her face. "Fix it how?" she asked, almost daring him to mean it. Caleb gestured toward the barn, where he'd stored lumber from a half-forgotten plan to expand the cabin. "Got wood out there. Can widen the doors, lower the counter, maybe build a ramp so you ain't stuck inside. Ain't much, but it's a start." Into two. Abigail stared at him, her fingers tightening on the rag she'd retrieved. "You'd change your house for me?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, laced with a vulnerability that made Caleb's chest ache. "It's our house now," he said, the words slipping out before he could weigh them. "Might as well make it livable." He stood, brushing beans from his hands, and offered a small, hesitant smile. "Unless you'd rather keep spillin' beans to keep me on my toes." Then, for the first time, Abigail laughed a short, surprised sound that lit her face like a sunrise. It was gone quickly, but it left a warmth in the room, a crack in the wall between them. "Fine," she said, her tone lighter. "But I'm holding you to it, Caleb Morrow." Over the next few days, Caleb threw himself into the work. He started with the doorway between the kitchen and main room, sawing the frame wider so Abigail's chair could pass without scraping. The labor was grueling, his hands soft from months of idleness now blistered and raw. He hauled lumber from the barn, the sun baking his shoulders as he measured and cut, each swing of the hammer a small defiance against the despair that had haunted him since Will's death. Abigail watched from the porch, her wheelchair positioned in the shade, her silence more curious than critical. Sometimes she'd call out suggestions. "Angle that board a bit left, it's crooked," and Caleb would nod, grateful for her sharp eye. One evening, as the sky burned orange and crickets began their chorus, Caleb sat on the porch steps, wiping sweat from his brow. His back ached, but the doorway was done, and Abigail had wheeled through it without a hitch, her face unreadable but her shoulders relaxed. She joined him now, her chair creaking softly on the new boards. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the prairie's hum. "I know," Caleb replied, staring at the horizon where the first stars were waking. He wanted to say more, that it felt good to build something, to do something right for once, but the words felt too big for the moment. "Then why are you?" Abigail asked, her blue eyes catching the last light, searching his face with an intensity that made him feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in months. Caleb hesitated, his fingers tracing a splinter in the step. The truth was a tangle of reasons: guilt, loneliness, a need to prove he wasn't the coward Clearwater believed him to be. But there was something else, something new, stirring in the quiet moments they'd shared. "Because it's right," he said finally, the words simple but heavy. "And because I reckon you deserve a place that don't fight you every step, Lou." Abigail's breath caught, and for a moment she looked away, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "You don't know me," she said, her voice barely audible. "Not really." "I know you ran a store," Caleb said, recalling her words from that first day. "Kept it going better than most men could. I know you paid for that chair yourself, which means you're stubborn as hell. And I know you ain't let this," he nodded toward her legs, "break you. That's enough to start. Though." She turned back to him, her eyes glistening but steady. "You're not what I expected," she admitted. "I thought you'd be, like them, the men who brought me here, laughing behind my back." Caleb's throat tightened. "I ain't laughing," he said, "and I ain't them." The silence that followed was different, softer, like the prairie after a rain. Abigail reached into the wooden box she always kept close, pulling out a small, leather-bound ledger. "This was from my father's store," she said, opening it to reveal neat columns of numbers, her handwriting precise. "I kept the books. If you're serious about fixing this place, I can help. Not just with sewing or cooking. I know how to make things work: numbers, supplies, plans." Caleb leaned closer, studying the pages. He'd never been much for figures, but her confidence was infectious, a glimpse of the woman she'd been before the accident. "You teach me that," he said, "and I'll keep building. Deal?" "Deal," she said, a real smile breaking through, small but genuine, like a flower pushing through cracked earth. That night, as Caleb lay on his cot in the main room, the cabin felt less like a prison. Abigail's soft breathing came from the bedroom, a reminder that he wasn't alone anymore. He thought of her ledger, her laugh, the way her eyes had softened when he'd called the cabin theirs. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something: trust, maybe, or the promise of it. Outside, the prairie whispered its secrets to the stars, and Caleb drifted to sleep with a feeling he hadn't known in months. Hope, fragile as a new blade of grass, but growing. The Nebraska Territory in early August 1867 was a land of restless skies, where the prairie could turn from serene to savage in a heartbeat. As dusk settled over Caleb Morrow's cabin, 5 miles east of Clearwater, storm clouds gathered like an army on the western horizon, their edges glowing with the last embers of sunset. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of rain, and the quiet rhythm of two people learning to coexist. 3 weeks had passed since Abigail Turner arrived, her wheelchair and sharp blue eyes transforming the cabin from a solitary refuge into a shared, if uneasy, home. Caleb and Abigail had found a tentative rhythm: widened doorways, a lowered counter, and shared tasks like ledger keeping had softened their edges, but trust was still a fragile thing, easily shaken by the ghosts of their pasts. Tonight, as thunder rumbled like distant cannons, a new threat loomed, one that would test their bond and force them to confront who they were when danger knocked. Caleb stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the flickering lamplight, watching the storm's approach. The prairie grass bent under a rising wind, and lightning split the sky, illuminating the endless expanse in stark white. He'd seen storms like this before: wild, unforgiving, capable of turning streams into torrents and scattering cattle like leaves. His hands, still sore from days of carpentry, tightened on the window frame. "Gonna be a bad one," he muttered, more to himself than to Abigail, who sat at the table, her needle pausing over a piece of blue calico she was mending. "Storms don't scare me," Abigail said, her voice steady but laced with a tension Caleb was beginning to recognize. She glanced at the window, her fingers resuming their work, though her eyes lingered on the darkening sky. "I've seen worse in Omaha. You just batten down and wait it out." Caleb nodded, but his gut churned. The prairie taught a man to trust his instincts, and something about the air tonight felt wrong, not just the storm, but a deeper unease, like the moment before a rattler strikes. He moved to the door, checking the latch, then glanced at his rifle propped by the fireplace. Abigail followed his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You expecting trouble?" she asked, setting the calico aside. "Just being careful," Caleb said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. He wanted to protect her from worry, but her sharp mind missed nothing. The truth was, word of their arrangement had spread. Silas Reed's cruel joke had made them a topic in Clearwater's saloons, and men with bad intentions often sniffed out easy prey. Caleb's reputation as a coward didn't help, painting a target on their isolated cabin. The first raindrops pattered against the roof, soft at first, then a steady drumbeat as the storm unleashed its fury. Thunder shook the walls, and the lamp's flame danced, casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Abigail wheeled herself to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. "We should secure the barn," she said, practical as ever. "Sage and the mules could spook." "Ha!" Caleb hesitated, reluctant to leave her alone, but she was right. "I'll be quick," he said, grabbing his hat and oilskin coat. "Keep the door barred." He stepped into the deluge, the rain cold and sharp against his face, and sprinted to the barn. Sage whinnied as he checked her stall, her eyes wide but calm under his touch. The mules were restless, but their ropes held. He tightened the barn door's latch, his boots sinking into mud, and turned back toward the cabin, lightning illuminating the prairie in jagged flashes. That's when he saw them three riders, their forms blurred by rain but unmistakable, approaching from the south. Their horses moved with purpose, heads low against the storm, and the glint of metal at their hips told Caleb they weren't lost travelers. His heart pounded, the old fear from the Apache raid clawing at him, but he forced it down. Abigail was inside, alone, and he wouldn't run this time. He slogged through the mud, reaching the porch as the riders reined up, their faces shadowed under dripping hats. The leader, a broad man with a black beard and eyes like flint, leaned forward in his saddle. "Evenin'," he called, his voice cutting through the storm's roar. "Name's Jed Carver. Mind if we take shelter? Storm's a devil tonight. Mend." Caleb stood under the porch's overhang, water streaming from his hat, his hand resting near the revolver at his hip. "Town's got a hotel," he said, his voice steady despite the ice in his veins. 5 miles west." Carver's smile was all teeth, no warmth. "Town's got sheriffs too, and questions we ain't keen on answerin'. We prefer the countryside." His gaze flicked to the cabin, lingering on the lamplight seeping through the shutters. "Heard you got a wife now. Pretty thing, they say. Must get lonesome out here for a woman in her condition." The words hit like a fist, and Caleb's vision flashed red. They knew about Abigail, her paralysis, the cruel marriage deal. Someone, likely Silas, had spread the story, painting them as easy marks. "My wife and I like our privacy," Caleb said, his hand inching closer to his gun. "You boys best move on." The second rider, a lean man with a scar across his cheek, laughed, the sound harsh against the rain. "Move on? With you, Morrow? Word is you run when things get hot. Left a man to die, didn't you?" The third rider, younger, with hungry eyes, leaned forward. "Wonder if the stories about your wife are true. Can't run, can she?" Caleb's blood roared, but before he could draw, the cabin door creaked behind him. Abigail had unbarred it, her wheelchair framed in the doorway, her face pale but composed. In her lap, hidden by a quilt, was her father's Colt revolver, its barrel steady. "You're not welcome here," she said, her voice clear and cold, cutting through the storm like a blade. "Ride on or you'll regret it." Carver's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing as he assessed her. "Feisty for a cripple," he said, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his tone. Abigail's grip on the Colt tightened, invisible to the riders but clear to Caleb, who felt a surge of awe. She wasn't just brave, she was dangerous. her calm masking a fire he hadn't seen before. "Get off my land," Caleb said, stepping in front of Abigail, his revolver now drawn. His voice carried a new weight, not just anger but resolve, born of the weeks spent building a life with her. "I won't say it again." For a long moment, the only sounds were rain hammering the roof and horses snorting in the dark. Carver studied Caleb, then Abigail, his confidence waning under their united front. "We'll be back," he said finally, his voice low. "Count on it." He wheeled his horse, and the others followed, their forms swallowed by the storm's veil. Caleb didn't move until they were gone, his heart hammering. Only then did he turn to Abigail, who was lowering the colt, her hands steady but her face pale. "You all right?" he asked, holstering his gun and closing the door against the rain. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice shook, betraying the fear she'd hidden. She wheeled back to the table, setting the colt down with care. "They knew about me, about us." "Silas," Caleb said, spitting the name like a curse. "He's been talking." He sat across from her, the lamp's glow softening the lines of her face. "You didn't have to open the door. Could have stayed safe." "Safe?" Abigail's eyes flashed. "I'm not some damsel, Caleb. I ran a store, dealt with men worse than them. I won't hide while you face trouble alone." Her words were fierce, but her hands trembled, and Caleb saw the cost of her courage. He leaned forward, his voice low. "I ain't running this time, Abigail. Not from them, not from anything. But I need to know those men, what they said about me. You think I'm still that coward?" She studied him, her blue eyes piercing, searching for the truth he barely understood himself. "I think you're a man who got scared once," she said finally. "But tonight, you didn't flinch. That's what matters." Caleb's throat tightened, her words a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. He thought of Will, of the raid, of the shame that had defined him. But here, with Abigail's steady gaze and the storm raging outside, he felt something shift a chance to be more than his past. "I won't let them hurt you," he said, the promise as much to himself as to her. Abigail nodded, her fingers brushing the colt. "And I won't let them hurt you." The cabin felt smaller, warmer, as if their shared defiance had carved out a space for something new. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, a fragile bond grew stronger, tempered by the shadows of threat and the light of their mutual resolve. In the Nebraska territory of February 1868, the prairie lay under a brittle frost, its vastness softened by the golden light of a winter sunset. 6 months had passed since the storm that brought outlaws to Caleb Morrow's doorstep, and in that time, his cabin, 5 miles east of Clearwater, had transformed. What began as a lonely shack was now the heart of the Morrow trading post, a bustling hub of commerce built on Caleb and Abigail Turner's shared vision. The cabin still stood, its widened doorways and sturdy ramp a testament to their early struggles. But a new structure loomed beside it, a wooden store, with broad windows and shelves stocked with flour, coffee, and tools. Travelers and ranchers came from miles around, drawn by fair prices and Abigail's sharp business mind. Yet success bred envy, and as dusk fell, a new threat emerged, one that would test their resilience and reveal the strength of the community they'd unknowingly forged. The trading post was a marvel of grit and ingenuity. Caleb had spent months hauling lumber and hammering nails, his hands now calloused but steady, each board a step toward redemption. Abigail managed the books, her ledger a masterpiece of precision, tracking every sale and supplier with the acumen she'd honed running her father's store in Omaha. Together they'd turned their forced marriage once, a cruel joke orchestrated by Silas Reed, into a partnership that hummed with purpose. Customers praised their efficiency. A rancher could buy oats, mend a harness, and share a cup of coffee in the time it took to hitch a team. Abigail, in her wheelchair, moved through the store with ease, her blue eyes catching every detail, while Caleb greeted travelers with a quiet warmth that belied his tarnished reputation. Their bond had deepened, not yet love but a mutual respect, forged in late-night talks over ledgers and shared glances when a customer left smiling. Tonight, Caleb was in Clearwater, collecting mail and supplies, his breath clouding in the frigid air as he loaded a wagon. Abigail remained at the trading post, balancing the day's accounts by lamplight, her wooden box holding her father's Colt and old letters close at hand. The store was quiet, the last customer gone, and the prairie outside was still, the frost glinting like diamonds under a rising moon. But beneath the calm, danger stirred. Silas Reed, humiliated by the morrow's success, had allied with Victor Hale, a wealthy merchant whose Clearwater store was losing customers to the trading post's better service. Their envy had festered into a plan, and as Caleb rode home, a glow on the horizon stopped his heart. Smoke curled against the sky, and the acrid scent of burning wood hit him like a blow. The trading post was ablaze. Caleb spurred Sage into a gallop, the wagon abandoned, his pulse roaring with fear. "Please let her be safe," he whispered, the words a prayer to a God he hadn't spoken to since Will's death. The prairie flew past, its frozen grass crunching under Sage's hooves, and as he crested the final hill, the sight tore at his soul. The trading post was engulfed, flames licking the night sky, its roof collapsing in a shower of sparks. But the cabin stood untouched, 50 yards away, and there, silhouetted against the inferno, was Abigail in her wheelchair, directing a bucket brigade of neighbors who'd come to fight the fire. Her voice, clear and commanding, cut through the chaos. "More water on the east wall. Keep it from the barn." Caleb dismounted, his legs trembling, and ran to her, dropping to his knees beside her chair. "Abigail, you hurt?" he asked, his hands hovering, afraid to touch her but needing to know she was whole. Her face was smudged with soot, her golden hair loose, but her eyes were fierce, undaunted. "I'm fine," she said, her voice catching as another beam fell, sending embers skyward. "But the store, it's gone." Her gaze met his, and for a moment, the weight of their lost 6 months of sweat, hope, and dreams threatened to break her composure. Caleb took her hand, his grip steady, and felt her fingers tighten in return. "How'd it start?" he asked, his voice low, though he dreaded the answer. "I don't know," Abigail said, her eyes on the flames. "I was in the cabin, finishing the books, when I smelled smoke. By the time I got outside, the back wall was burning. It spread too fast to be an accident." Her words hung heavy, and Caleb's gut twisted. This was no act of nature, someone had meant to destroy them. Tom Henderson, a rancher from 5 miles south, jogged over, his face streaked with sweat despite the cold. "We got here quick as we could, Morrow," he said, clutching an empty bucket. "But the fire had a head start. I'm sorry." His wife Ellen joined him, offering Abigail a canteen, her eyes soft with sympathy. More neighbors arrived, John Patterson and his sons, old Mrs. Mackenzie with a basket of bread, even young Ellie Burke, the sheriff's daughter, carrying blankets. These were people Caleb and Abigail had served, families they'd helped with credit or shelter, now risking the night's chill to stand with them. Caleb rose, his jaw tight, and joined the brigade, hauling water from the trough to douse the smoldering edges. Abigail coordinated from her chair, her voice a beacon in the dark, assigning tasks with the precision of a general. But the fire was merciless, and by dawn, the trading post was a ruin, charred timbers, melted glass, and the acrid stench of lost dream. Caleb stood among the wreckage, his boots crunching ash, and felt the weight of failure settle on him. 6 months of work, their inventory, their future gone. Abigail wheeled beside him, her face pale but resolute, her ledger clutched like a lifeline. 6 months, she said quietly, her voice thick with grief. "All our supplies, our equipment, we invested everything for the winter season." Her eyes scanned the debris, and Caleb saw the fear she wouldn't voice, that this loss might break what they'd built, not just the store but the fragile trust between them. "We can rebuild," Caleb said, though his heart felt like stone. "We did it once, we can do it again." His words were more hope than certainty, but he meant them, for her, for them. "With what?" Abigail asked, her voice sharp with pragmatism. "The insurance won't cover half of this. We've got your savings, the $50 from my uncle, but it's not enough." She looked away, her hands tightening on her chair. Maybe this was a fool's dream. Caleb knelt beside her, his hand resting on hers, warm against the morning's chill. "It ain't a fool's dream," he said, his voice fierce. "We built something real here, Abigail. Not just a store, but a place people need. We'll find a way." Her eyes met his, searching, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just them, two souls refusing to break. Sheriff Amos Burke arrived with the sunrise, his weathered face grim as he sifted through the ruins. After an hour, he approached, holding a glass bottle that reeked of coal oil. "This was buried under some boards," he said, his voice low. "Fire didn't start by accident, folks." Caleb's blood ran cold, anger rising like a tide. "Someone burned us out," he said, the words a growl. "Looks that way," Burke said. "Question is, who?" Before Caleb could answer, a wagon rolled up, driven by Captain Daniel Reedno, relation to Silas, whose freight runs supplied half the territory. Beside him sat Silas Reed, hands tied, his face defiant but pale. "Found this fool trying to sell your goods in Millerville," Daniel said, climbing down. "Sacks of flour, tools, even some of Abigail's sewing kits, all smellin' of smoke." Abigail's eyes narrowed, her voice steel. "You did this, Silas. You couldn't stand us succeeding," Silas sneered, but his bravado faltered under Burke's glare. "You can't prove nothin'," he said, though his voice wavered. "Can't I?" Burke pulled out a notebook. "Got witnesses who saw you ridin' this way last night with Victor Hale. Got the Millerville storekeeper who marked your goods. It's enough to hold you till we find Hale." Silas's defiance crumbled, his shoulders sagging as Burke cuffed him to the wagon. Caleb stepped toward Silas, his fists clenched, the urge to strike nearly overwhelming. Silas had mocked him, burned his home, threatened everything he and Abigail had built, but Abigail's hand on his arm stopped him, her touch grounding. "He's not worth it," she said softly. "Let the law handle him." Caleb exhaled, his anger cooling into resolve. He wouldn't be the man Silas wanted him to be, not a coward, not a brawler, but a man of honor. As Burke prepared to leave with Silas, neighbors lingered, their support a quiet miracle. The Hendersons brought soup, the Pattersons offered to clear debris, and Mrs. Mackenzie pressed a cloth bag into Abigail's hands. "From folks who couldn't come," she said, her voice gruff. Inside were coins and small sums from hard-working families, totaling over $60. Abigail's eyes welled, her voice breaking. "Why?" she asked. "Why do this for us?" "Because you did it for us," Tom Henderson said. "When my boy was sick, you gave us medicine on credit. When our wagon broke, you fixed it, no charge. You're our people now." Caleb looked at the faces around them, ranchers, farmers, widow sand, saw not pity but pride. They'd built more than a store, they'd built a community. "We'll rebuild," Caleb said, his voice strong, meeting Abigail's gaze. "Bigger, better, together." She nodded, her smile small but radiant, and in that moment their shared loss became a shared vow, their bond forged anew in the ashes of their dream. The Nebraska Territory in May 1868 bloomed with the tentative green of spring, the prairie awakening after a harsh winter that had tested the resolve of every soul in Clearwater. 3 months after the fire that reduced their trading post to ashes, Caleb Morrow and Abigail Turner stood on the porch of a new, larger structure, its fresh pine walls gleaming under the morning sun. The Morrow trading post, rebuilt with the sweat of neighbors and the couple's unyielding determination, was a testament to their partnership, a partnership born from a cruel jest, but now the heart of a thriving community. Today was the grand reopening, a celebration of resilience, but as wagons rolled in from across the territory, a shadow lingered. Success had made them targets, and a letter from Abigail's cousin threatened to unravel the fragile love growing between them. In the crucible of danger and choice, their hearts would face their truest test. The new trading post was a marvel, twice the size of the original, with wide aisles for Abigail's wheelchair and a sturdy ramp Caleb had built with care. Shelves brimmed with good sacks of flour, bolts of cloth, tools polished to a shine, and a back room served as their living quarters. cozy with a quilt Abigail had sewn. The post had become more than a store. It was a lifeline for ranchers, a rest stop for travelers, and thanks to a contract with the Territorial Mail Service, an official mail stop. Caleb moved through the crowd now, shaking hands with familiar faces: Tom Henderson, who'd donated lumber; Ellen Patterson, who'd helped clear debris; old Mrs. Mackenzie, whose sharp tongue hid a generous heart; Abigail, in her green dress, her golden hair pinned neatly, managed the counter, her ledger open as she greeted customers with a smile that warmed the morning chill. Their partnership was seamless, her business acumen balancing his practical grit, but beneath their ease lay questions neither had dared voice. Was this life enough? Was their bond real, or just a necessity born of circumstance? The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew a crowd of nearly 100 families in wagons, cowboys on horseback, even merchants from Clearwater who'd once scoffed at their venture. A golden ribbon stretched across the porch, glinting in the sun, a symbol of hope reborn. Caleb stood beside Abigail, his hat in hand, his chest tight with pride but also unease. Since the fire, rumors of Victor Hale's whereabouts had swirled. The merchant who'd conspired with Silas Reed to burn them out had vanished, leaving Silas to face justice alone. Caleb's eyes scanned the horizon, where a lone rider had appeared on a distant hill, watching but not approaching. Something about the figure's posture stirred his instincts, honed from years on the prairie, but before he could dwell on it, Mayor Ellis, a portly man with newfound respect for the Morrows, stepped forward to speak. "Folks," Ellis began, his voice carrying over the chatter, "today ain't just about a store. It's about what happens when good people stand together. The Morrows faced fire, theft, and worse, but they didn't quit, and neither did you." The crowd murmured agreement, and Caleb felt Abigail's hand brush his, a fleeting touch that steadied him. But as Ellis handed Abigail a pair of oversized scissors for the ribbon, a gunshot cracked across the prairie, splintering the porch post inches from her head. Screams erupted, and Caleb pulled Abigail down, shielding her as the crowd scattered behind wagons and barrels. "Everyone down," Sheriff Amos Burke shouted, drawing his pistol, his badge glinting in the chaos. The rider from the hill was galloping toward them now, his face clear in the sunlight. Victor Hale, his eyes wild with vengeance, a rifle in his hands. "You ruined me," he screamed, firing again, the bullet shattering a window and sending glass raining onto the porch. Women grabbed children, men reached for guns, and Caleb's heart pounded, the old fear from the Apache raid clawing at him. But Abigail's voice cut through his panic, calm and fierce. "Caleb, move," she said, her wheelchair already positioned behind a crate, her father's Colt steady in her hands. Her blue eyes were steel, her aim unwavering, and Caleb realized she wasn't just his partner, she was a force. He drew his revolver, crouching beside her, as Hale closed the distance, his horse's hooves thundering. "He's too far for a clean shot," Burke muttered, squinting down his barrel. "Range is bad." "Not for me," Abigail said, her voice steady as stone. Caleb glanced at her, stunned. "Abigail, no, he's moving too fast. I hit a playing card at 20 paces when I was 16, she said, her gaze locked on Hale. 200 or 20, a target's a target. Hale raised his rifle, aiming for the crowd, and Caleb's breath caught, knowing he'd be close enough to kill in seconds. But Abigail's Colt boomed, a single shot that struck Hale's rifle stock, sending it flying from his hands. His horse reared, throwing him to the ground, where he lay stunned, his vengeance broken. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Burke, with 2 deputies, rushed to cuff Hale, his face a mix of shock and defeat. Caleb stared at Abigail, her hands steady as she lowered the Colt, her expression calm but her eyes alive with fire. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" he asked, awe softening his voice. "Behind my father's store," she said, a small smile breaking through. "I told you I could hit a card, never said it was the ace of spades." The crowd's mood shifted from fear to celebration, but Caleb saw the tremor in her hands now, the adrenaline fading. He knelt beside her, his heart swelling with something deeper than respect. "You saved us," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. "We saved us," she corrected, her eyes meeting his. And for a moment, the world was just them, the prairie breeze carrying away the last echoes of gunfire. As the ribbon was cut, and the crowd surged into the store, Abigail wheeled to a quiet corner of the porch, pulling a letter from her pocket. The envelope was fine paper, sealed with wax, and Caleb's stomach sank as she spoke. "It's from my cousin, Robert, in Omaha," she said, her voice flat. "He's offering to sell me back half of my father's store. Says he's reconsidered his stance on women in business. I'd have my own income, my own place above the shop." She paused, her fingers tracing the seal. "He'll even pay you double what Uncle Amos gave compensation for your trouble." Caleb felt the words like bullets, each one piercing the fragile hope he'd nurtured. "He wants to buy you back," he said, his voice rough. "Like your property." Abigail looked at him, her blue eyes raw, with a sadness that cut deeper than Hale's gunfire. "I need to know why you married me, Caleb," she said, her voice breaking. "Not the words you say to make me feel better. The truth. Was it the money, pity, or something else?" Caleb sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly, the weight of her question heavier than any threat. He'd avoided this truth, fearing it would expose his weakness, but her eyes demanded honesty, and he owed her that much. "The money was part of it," he admitted, his voice low. $50 was more than I'd seen in months, and I was drowning in this place, alone with my shame. He paused, meeting her gaze. "But it wasn't just that. I was lonely, Abigail, so lonely. I'd talked to Sage like she could answer. And when I met you, I saw something in you. Not pity, not brokenness, but strength. The way you looked at me, like you saw more than a coward. I wanted to know that woman, even if I didn't deserve her." Abigail's breath hitched, her eyes glistening. "You think I'm strong?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I feel like a burden, Caleb. My family sent me away because I was too much trouble. If I could walk, if I had my old life, would you have wanted me then? Or do you only care because we're both damaged?" The question hung between them, raw and aching, and Caleb felt the weight of their shared wounds. "If you were that woman in Omaha running a store, we might never have met," he said, his voice steady but soft. "But I know who you are now, and I know what we've built. It's real, Abigail, more real than anything I've ever had. I don't want you because you're damaged. I want you because you're you." She looked away, tears spilling down her cheeks, and Caleb's heart cracked, fearing he'd lost her. But then she took his hand, her grip fierce. "Robert's offering my old life back," she said. "Independence, respect, everything I lost. But it's not everything I've found." She met his eyes, her smile trembling but true. "You see me, Caleb, not my chair, not my past. You changed your home for me, stood against outlaws for me. I'm staying, not because I have to, but because I want us to build this together, equal partners." Caleb's throat tightened, and he squeezed her hand, the prairie stretching endless before them, full of promise. "Equal partners," he said, the words a vow. As the celebration continued, the crowd's laughter mingling with the scent of fresh pine, Caleb and Abigail stood together, their choice of heart stronger than any fire or foe, their love a quiet fire that would light their way forward. In the spring of 1871, Denver buzzed with the energy of a city on the cusp of greatness, its streets alive with the clatter of wagons and the ambitions of a growing Nebraska territory. The Territorial Commerce Commission's annual meeting filled the capital's grand auditorium, a cavernous hall of polished wood and chandeliers, where business owners, ranchers, and officials gathered to shape the region's future. At the speaker's podium stood Abigail Turner Morrow, her wheelchair positioned to command the room, her golden hair catching the gaslight as her voice rang with a confidence honed over 3 years of struggle and triumph. Beside her, in the front row, sat Caleb Morrow, his weathered face glowing with pride. What began as a cruel jokia, forced marriage, meant to mock two broken soulshad, forged a partnership that transformed their lives and the territory itself. Today, their story would face its final test, proving that love, honor, and community could outshine even the darkest shadows. The auditorium was packed. Over 300 faces, merchants in fine suits, ranchers in dusty boots, women from the Territorial Women's Association watching Abigail with rapt attention. The Morrow trading post, rebuilt after the arson that nearly destroyed it, had become a beacon of commerce, serving travelers along a new mail route and employing 12 locals. Its success had drawn the governor's notice, leading to Abigail's appointment to the Commerce Commission, where she documented 40 cases of business harassment across the territory. Now, she was advocating for the Morrow Fair Commerce Act, a law to protect honest enterprises from corruption. When we started our trading post, Abigail began, her voice clear as a prairie stream, they called us Brokena coward and a woman who couldn't walk, settled for each other out of desperation. The crowd stirred, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. They were wrong about the desperation, but right about one thing. We were broken. Yet being broken doesn't mean being worthless. It means you're ready to rebuild into something stronger. Caleb's chest swelled, his eyes fixed on Abigail. The shy, guarded woman who'd arrived in a wagon 3 years ago was gone, replaced by a leader whose words carried the weight of their shared journey. He remembered the nights they'd spent rebuilding, the community's coins and lumber, the moment Abigail chose him over her old life in Omaha. Their love, once a fragile spark, was now a steady flame, forged in fire, gunfire, and countless quiet moments. But as Abigail spoke, a commotion at the back of the hall drew Caleb's gaze. A man pushed through the crowd, his movements sharp with anger, his face familiar yet chilling. Elias Hale, brother of Victor Hale, the merchant who'd burned their store and died in prison 6 months ago. "Mrs. Morrow," Elias shouted, his voice cutting through the applause like a whip. "What about honest businessmen destroyed by your special treatment?" The room fell silent, heads turning as security guards moved toward him. Abigail raised a hand, calm as ever, her blue eyes locking onto Elias with empathy and resolve. "I'd be happy to address you, sir," she said, her tone steady. "What's your name?" "Elias Hale," he spat, his face flushed. "Victor was my brother. He was no criminal, just a man protecting his livelihood from your unfair competition. You and your husband ruined him with lies and political connections." His words hung like smoke, stirring doubt in some faces, those who didn't know the full story of the Morrow's trials. Caleb tensed, his hand brushing the revolver he no longer carried, a habit from their dangerous days. He wanted to stand, to defend Abigail, but her glance sharp, reassuring kept him seated. She didn't need saving. She never had. "Mr. Hale," Abigail said, her voice soft but unyielding, "I'm sorry for your loss. Losing family is a wound that never fully heals." Her sincerity disarmed the room, even Elias, whose shoulders slumped slightly. "But your brother wasn't convicted for competing. He was convicted for arson and theft crimes proven by evidence. A coal oil bottle in our burned store, stolen goods he tried to sell, witnesses who saw him that night." "You set him up," Elias countered, his voice shaking. "You, your husband, that corrupt sheriff, you used your sob story to win favor." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Caleb felt the old sting of the word coward, but it no longer cut. Too much had changed, too many battles fought, too many nights spent building a life with Abigail. "Mr. Hale," Abigail said, her tone patient but firm, "what destroyed your brother wasn't us. It was his choice to tear down instead of build up. When our trading post succeeded, he had two paths: improve his business or destroy ours. He chose destruction." She gestured to the audience. "Every person here faces competition. Some respond by serving their customers better. Others, like your brother, try to burn out those who threaten them." A new voice broke in, commanding attention. Governor Harrison rose from his seat, his presence silencing the room. "Mrs. Morrow had no political protection when her store burned," he said, his words carrying the weight of his office. She had something stronger, a community that saw her value. He turned to the crowd. I visited the Morrow trading post. It's the most successful in the territory not because of favors, but because of fair prices, quality goods, and honest service. They employ 12 people, shelter travelers, and pay more taxes than businesses twice their size. Caleb's heart swelled as familiar faces stood to speak. Tom Henderson, the rancher, recounted how the Morrows gave him credit during hard times. Ellen Patterson praised their shelter during a blizzard. Captain Daniel Reed, the freighter, stood tall. I've hauled goods for 20 years, he said. The Morrows succeed because they focus on customers, not competitors. That's what Victor Hale never understood. The crowd buzzed with agreement, their voices a chorus of support, drowning out Elias's fading defiance. Elias looked around, his anger crumbling under the weight of the community's truth. They're still just a coward and he began, but his voice faltered, lacking conviction. They were charity cases. Were they? Governor Harrison asked, his gaze steady. From where I stand, they're what this territory needs: people who turn hardship into opportunity, who build bridges instead of walls. Elias stood silent, then turned slowly toward the exit. At the door, he paused. I hope you're right, he said quietly, and was gone. The auditorium erupted in applause as the Morrow Fair Commerce Act passed unanimously, establishing protections for honest businesses across the territory. Officials crowded around Abigail, offering congratulations. But Caleb's eyes never left her. She'd become more than his wife. She was his partner, his equal, his reason to believe in himself again. As the crowd dispersed, they found themselves alone on the Capitol's steps, the Denver skyline glowing under a setting sun. The air was warm, scented with blooming sage, and the distant whistle of a train promised new horizons. Do you ever think about it? Abigail asked, her hand resting in his, her wheelchair steady on the smooth stone. What might have happened if Silas hadn't forced us together? Sometimes, Caleb admitted, his voice soft. But not with regret. I think we'd have found each other somehow, some way. He smiled, his weathered face softening. Maybe not in a wagon, maybe not in Clearwater, but the universe would have made sure we didn't miss each other. Abigail's laugh was bright, like spring water over stones. You really believe that? I believe some folks are meant to be partners, he said, squeezing her hand. Meant to build something together that neither could alone. The fire, the outlaws, the hate, it was all just the world's way of pointing us to each other. One. She looked at him, her blue eyes shining with a love that had grown through every trial. What's next? She asked, her voice full of possibility. Whatever we choose, Caleb said, gesturing to the city below, alive with promise. Together. The prairie, once a place of shame and isolation, now stretched before them, full of friends, dreams, and a future they'd carved from the ashes of their pasts. As they sat, hand in hand, the lights of Denver twinkled like stars brought to earth. The lonely cowboy and the woman society had discarded had become the pride of the plains, not because they were perfect, but because they'd learned that love and honor could grow from the most broken ground. The train whistle echoed again, a call to new adventures, and Caleb and Abigail faced it together, their hearts united, their legacy sealed in the community they'd built and the love that had made them whole. As the Denver sunset bathed the Capitol steps in gold, Caleb Morrow and Abigail Turner sat hand in hand, their silhouettes framed against the boundless Nebraska prairie. From a cruel jest meant to break theme, a disgraced cowboy and a discarded woman, they'd forged a love that defied the harshest storms, outlaws, and envy. Their trading post, reborn from ashes, stood as a beacon of community, its wide aisles and warm hearth proof that worth isn't defined by society's judgment, but by the courage to rise, to build, to love. The Morrow Fair Commerce Act, passed in that crowded auditorium, was more than law. It was their legacy, ensuring no honest soul would face the destruction they'd endured. Their journey taught a timeless truth: brokenness is not the end, but the beginning of something stronger, when two hearts choose to heal together. This lesson lingers like a prairie breezer: flaws don't define us, our choices do. Caleb and Abigail chose honor, partnership, and community, proving that love can bloom in the hardest ground. Let their story inspire you to see your own struggles as seeds for growth, to build bridges where others see walls, and to find strength in those who see your true value. If this tale of grit and heart moved you, join our community at Wild West Love Tales on YouTube. Subscribe to hear more stories of love that conquers all, and drop the number 8 in the comment sauce symbol of eternal love, like Caleb and Abigail's, that endures forever. Share your thoughts, and let's keep the spirit of the plains alive.